We're going to get started. Thank you for coming. I appreciate you taking the time to come learn a little bit more about what we've been up to in terms of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. It's a little bit after 6:30, and again, we will be respectful of your time this evening. If you don't have one, on the back, there's an agenda. Talks a little bit about the night tonight. Included on that document is a bit.ly link. If you go home and take a look at that link, it will actually be a PDF version of the presentation. In terms of the presentation, you have an opportunity to have that to review at a later time. And the presentation, the last slide, does have Steve Lotch's email address and mine, so if you get through the end and there's a question that you haven't had answered or you have some thoughts you want to share with us, you can use that, and again, it's in that link for that. The process right now, I think you've seen Ms. Melcher and Ms. Washington have been kind of sharing information, and the question cards, they will come inside once we start the presentation in the back corner here, and if you have a question that comes to you, I know they've collected some already, if you have one that hasn't been you haven't submitted and or we talk about something that you want to submit, just going back, you can get it to Ms. Washington, they'll get it down to Mr. Lodge to start that. The welcome tonight is going to be presented by our board president, Mr. Paul Heining. Paul?
Thank you, Superintendent Graydon. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for attending tonight, and thank you for your interest, as always, in Saline area schools. Special thank you to the DEI committee here. I mean, it's been a process, and I think last week, I should say they, because board members aren't allowed to speak at the committee. I think they kind of reached a little bit of a plateau and I think have some clear direction. So it's good. The board created this committee for us to gather input from the community so that we can create some DEI policies, which we do not have right now. Every day, this has been kind of my talk, 6,000 people show up on the campus of Saline area schools, and every day those 6,000 people come up, they all have their own bias, they all got up on one side of the bed or the other, they all have their own interest, they all have something going on in their lives. So we need to account for all of those 6,000 peoples every day. And it's difficult at best some days it's a little easier. So I hope the information you hear tonight is helpful to you. And if your questions aren't answered, I know this question answered later, please send those in and we'll get to them eventually. So enjoy.
All right, on that end, we are going to be respectful of time. Understand that Steve Lotch and I are committed to be here as long as necessary. So, if you have to leave, feel free, obviously, to get up and leave. If at the end of the night at 8, when we kind of wrap things up, if you want to stay and have further conversation, we will remain as long as necessary. I'm going to start with a little bit of an overview of the committee, and in terms of kind of where it started and some understanding in terms of how it relates specifically to the district as a whole. Dr. Lotch is going to talk a little bit about members, vision, and charge. What DEI is not. Actually, one of the representatives from the committee, Shannon Washington, is going to talk a little bit about that. Andre Hardy is going to talk a little bit about the DEI definitions and process. They were involved with that at our last meeting, and I'll jump back up for talk about kind of next agenda, next steps, and timeline associated with the activities that we've established, and then we'll have some question and answer period. One of the things that, if anyone knows me very well, I love talking about the compass, but really our learner profile is something that's become kind of a guiding image for us. It's an icon in many ways. If you've been in our buildings, you see it everywhere, and it's more than an image and a compass. It does help us really think about the work that we have as a school district, and as many of you know, Saline area schools has high levels of achievement as it relates to particularly standardized testing and some other academic measures. We also have a charge to really deepen our learning in terms of what we provide for our students and our expectations for our students, and we've really built our learner profile that looks at that and thinks about what are the skills and attributes necessary for success moving forward. And so through that process, back through an extended period of time in 2016, we adopted the compass and have been continually working to refine and define what those attributes mean and how can we best really work towards those attributes. And so one of the attributes we have is that we want our students to be ethical and responsible citizens. This means that students are ethical and responsible citizens when they see beyond themselves to the needs of others. They contribute to their community, promote social justice, take responsibility for the environment, demonstrate respect, empathy, and compassion. And then it rolls into some student will statements. Internally, we continue to define that even further and further and further as we really want to say, how do you assess some of these things? But I want to say the bedrock of our learner profile, and certainly the bedrock of our organization, is these are the attributes we want our students to embody. And so when you think about why are we talking about some of these issues, or how did this come, it really does start there. Our district strategic framework, which is due for some conversation next year, in terms of a review, but we've had a 4-goal district framework for a long time. The idea of our strategic framework is that given the pace of change in society, given the pace and change in educational environments, a framework, in our minds, works better than a plan, because we need to continue to refine it. And if you lay out a 5-year plan in an organization like Saline Area Schools right now, I will tell you we'll miss the mark every time, because things happen too fast. The environment is changing too fast. We need to be flexible of that. And so a framework works better for us. We've had the goal 3 for a long time. It's to enhance the positive school environment that promotes student, staff, well-being, satisfaction, and positive morale. And then we have some action steps there. The first step is to implement diversity awareness. Again, this document actually precedes the compass in terms of where we're at organizationally. And so again, I just want to kind of articulate how this process really does start at the fundamental level for us as an organization. In addition to that, these are the conversations that have been going on internally for quite some time. The Washington Intermediate School District has a program related to justice leaders and core courses. We've had 20+ Saline Area School participants go through that. One of those participants is Kelly Tressler. She is, with the exception of Dr. Lotch and myself, she is the only kind of school staff person who's on the DEI committee. We've had presentations from a gentleman by the name of Dr. Jay Marks. Dr. Marks works in Oakland County for Oakland Schools, but has provided us with training, particularly at the administrative level, twice. Back in August of 2017, he came and really started to have the conversation with us as administrators about identity, understanding where we come relative to particularly to issues of bias, and how can we be ethically responsible as administrators to really make sure that we're walking the walk as adults in our organization. Came back and worked with us again in January, and then last year he was part of our kickoff. We had the auditorium at the high school full, and he talked up to our staff really again about these issues of equity and how are we as an organization understanding ourselves so that we can better serve our students and work with our students. One of the things that came out in the fall, we had a pretty serious issue at Heritage School. It was a racial issue, and we worked through that. We dealt with that. I don't know that we handled it the way we wanted to handle it. I know I personally felt uncomfortable with how I addressed that in the short term, and really wanted to better understand that, and that created a larger conversation that we continue to work through today. But it allowed us to say we need to really think and talk to our community about what they feel as it relates to us as an organization. And so we had 2 different community forums, community conversations specifically where I wanted people to come and community members to come and give me feedback in terms of how we're acting as an organization. And these were the 4 themes that came out of that. There's a discussion around our hiring practices related to staff members, how diverse is our staff, and we've continued to kind of work through that and have implemented some things this year as we know we're hiring a lot of certified staff. This idea of culturally competent and culturally responsive teaching methods, and not to dive into kind of instructional practice, but really how are we looking at our practices as associated with classroom instruction that are embodying the idea of understanding that students come to us with a very diverse perspectives and diverse needs, and how can we best do that? At its core, I will say that some of the cultural responsive teaching methods, and if you Google that and think about that, that's just almost what I would call best practice or just great instructional strategies. And so I'm excited about our ability to kind of work through that and look more at that. Curricular options and celebrations and events. We really talked about what are the things that we celebrate in terms of our community, and what are the things that we don't. How do we go about understanding what the perspectives are in each of our classrooms? Our teachers have started to do things more along asking their students what holidays do they celebrate in their home, so we can better understand the context with which we're teaching in and our students are coming to us in. And then communicating policies. What are our policies around, we talk about things like restorative practices, or how do we handle issues related to what I would call hateful activities or racial issues. We need to really understand that from a policy standpoint and from a practice standpoint. And so those were the themes that emerged from that, those conversations, and it led to us a January 8th board meeting where we shared that information with the board. and really we're charged with the committee. So I'll turn it over now to Dr. Lodge, talk a little bit more about the committee.
Thank you, Superintendent Graydon. So in terms of our committee, the committee is a representative sample of those who applied to look at different perspectives. And we want to publicly acknowledge the group. It's hard to read in the backs. I wanted to just acknowledge Shamal Buva, Afifa Corrigan, Andre Harding, Lauren Hornberger, Keith Cable, Jessica Lafort, Smita Nagpal, Danielle Nichols-Slavinsky, Chrissy Para, Nicole Rogan, Vivek Sankaran, Elizabeth Soto, Kelly Tressler, Shannon Washington, Ira Weintraub, and Melissa Zaksik. And then overseeing the process, we have 3 board members, Susan Estep, Paul Heineck, Michael McVeigh, and Scott and myself. In terms of the committee vision and charge, the vision, as Superintendent Graydon just mentioned, established at the January 8th Board of Education meeting to establish a systemic and strategic implementation of the DEI principles over multiple years to build capacity and organizational awareness. And so when we look at the charge that was defined the other night at the DEI committee, it's as follows: through continuing education, our own continuing education. In other words, our committee needs to learn about this work as well. And so we are embarking on education for ourselves, and we're developing a clear definition of diversity, equity, and inclusion as it relates to the Saline Area Schools community. And you will see coming up in a future slide that we are defining what exactly does DEI mean to the Saline Area Schools. Also in the charge, we are advocates for a culturally inclusive curriculum and a safe and supportive environment, and that's for all Saline Area School students and staff. I wanted to provide you an example of what that might mean. So we are looking in the English department right now at the high school at the kinds of trade books that are being read in the high school and looking at the fact that many, if not all, of our trade books that students are reading aren't coming from a diverse perspective. So we want to be looking at what authors, African-American authors or Native American authors can provide that will be giving diverse perspectives on the way that students are learning about history, literature, and so forth. So that's an example where we would turn that back to the DEI committee to discuss that, not to approve, but to discuss that path as we move forward. And I'm going to turn it over to Shannon to talk about what DEI committee is not.
Good evening. Sometimes it's helpful to know what we will not do or what we will not be doing, particularly if you're forming questions about this committee. So kind of like what Dr. Lash was speaking about, we do not approve or ban books. It's actually better to think about the fact that we may have conversations about different books. And those conversations, as being observed by the administrators and the board, will help to inform decisions that they will make, but we won't make those decisions. We kind of come together with a multitude of perspectives and have a rich conversation about those topics, and that conversation and those processes will help decisions to be made somewhere else. So we don't approve curriculum. We are not connected to the Sex Education Advisory Board. We do not have any powers to allocate anything, particularly resources. We are not involved in the process of hiring staff, and obviously we will not approve board policy. So in effect, we will function as a place where administrators and the board members can come and listen and listen to us engage in some conversations, and there'll be difficult conversations, but because of the diversity of the group, the conversations are rich, and they can be varied depending on what the topic, but it's information that our leaders can use. This is Andre Harding.
Thank you, Shannon. Hello, everybody. We have our definitions up there. I know I always, been an educator of 20 plus years, I always told students to never read off of PowerPoints and slides, but I will because I think it's important that I do, and it's quite small. I don't know if everyone can see it in the room. In composing these definitions, there was a small group of us who got together, who composed the definitions, and then we reported out to the larger group. I know when you look at these definitions, a year from now, they may change. We may have to add something. I think in composing definitions, we have to continuously scan our environment, see what type of environment we're becoming, and change our definitions to that environment. So with that said, when it comes to diversity, by embracing diversity, we mean embracing, honoring, celebrating the wide array of differences within us, including, but not limited to, race, age, sex, body type, gender expression, gender identity, color, socioeconomic class, ethnicity, language, culture, sexual orientation, nation of origin, religion, spirituality, and persons with disabilities. I know one thing today, while I was subbing today, I had a student who was Muslim. And having that student in the classroom, I know that right now Ramadan is going on. And I know that there are some kids who are fasting. So being a smart person and being an educator, I wouldn't sit, and when I had a kid who was sitting with me, I wouldn't sit and eat a full meal right in front of that kid when that kid is fasting. That's just being a kind human being. So that's what I mean when it comes to embracing, honoring, and celebrating right there. That's just being respectful. Second definition, by equity. By equity, we mean ensuring fairness within our educational community and addressing the inequalities that may exist with our historically marginalized communities. I know there should be, hopefully, by the time we meet a little bit more, we'll have more definitions up there to tell you what marginalized means and what other words means, because I know that not all of us are familiar with these changing terms in our society. Continuing the definition, each and every member of our educational community will have the opportunity, resources, and support to thrive and grow. And finally, by inclusion, we mean encouraging, promoting, and sustaining a true sense of belonging and empowerment for each member of our educational community, especially those who are historically marginalized. Thank you.
So, what's next for the DEI committee? I will tell you, we're looking at our next agenda is built around the review of student discipline policy and practices related to racial and social identity. Again, I go back to the situation we had at Heritage, really looking about how we handle those types of situations. Improving communication resources related to DEI-related topics. We've been posting the notes on the front page of the website. The conversation at the last meeting was, let's have a tab, a spot where that will reside. So if you come to the Saline Area School website, salineareaschools.org, you can click on a DEI tab or button, and then all of the resources associated with our activities there would be there, as well as not only what we're working on and what are some we're talking about, the definitions, other things will be there, but we've also started to mine some other activities within our district that we do. That would be a spot for us to be able to share those as well. And again, right, kind of above the fold, so to speak, in terms of where we're at. Conducting a needs assessment. We have a needs assessment tool that we're looking at right now to really understand where we're at, and if you've been an IEP, what is our present level of performance as it relates to various factors associated with our cultural responsiveness as an organization. It would be something we're really looking at, really defining that and going over that with the DEI committee. Reviewing different models. This activity, the idea of a diversity and equity committee, is not new. Honestly, virtually, most of the districts of our size in Southeast Michigan have some version of this. We've had some conversation with them. We've also started to look nationally. Are there other models out there that really allow districts to really fundamentally understand where we can go with some of these activities? Continue to gather feedback and share progress. Nights like tonight, other opportunities, community conversations, again, to really seek additional feedback. One of the things that I think we need to do more of, and it came up today at a conversation I had at Heritage Elementary, was what are we doing relative to our staff, particularly our teaching faculty, and in terms of working with them, gathering feedback from them, understanding kind of what are the challenges they face. One of the things we've talked about, how do we make sure they're aware and they understand how to interrupt certain behaviors they see in their classroom. We have to do more about that, and that was a conversation that, again, came up today. Developing a district equity plan. We have a strategic framework. We have a compass and whatnot that guides us as a district. If we were to break that out and look at what are our strategies associated with making sure that we're this culturally responsive organization and that we're welcoming an inclusive environment, that would be a way just to really continue to define those things. And then a sustainable structure. It is the intention that Some of you are familiar with our wellness committee, the DEI committee perhaps will be reconstituted in January of 2020, but ultimately becomes a sustainable structure where there's a place for us to review aspects of this in terms of an organization as we move forward. So those are kind of our next steps relative to the committee. Our next meeting is scheduled for June 4th, and we're going to need to adjust that because that is a Muslim holiday. So we're going to walk the walk there. All right, we plowed through that pretty quick. Time for questions and answers. Again, our email addresses are there, and if you have a copy of the agenda, the bit.ly link is essentially what you just saw presented here, and we'll go from there. Dr. Lodge?
Check, okay. So the process is that Laura Washington and Carol Melcher have been taking question and comment cards in the back, or question slips, and you can continue to provide those to them. If you have a comment itself, that isn't going to be read here if it's strictly a comment. However, we will take those back to the DEI committee to discuss those in further detail. But the purpose of this Q&A session is to actually get to the questions that all of you have. We'll ask as many of the questions as we can and provide answers up till 8 o'clock. And then after, like Scott mentioned, we'll both stay and engage in any dialogue that anybody who wants to still have some at the end. Okay, so we'll start with the question. First question. We're not reading names as to who submitted. We're simply reading the question itself. Okay. There are solutions that are fair to all. This isn't a zero-sum game. We can elevate without pushing others down or out. Strong national influences are trying to convince us there are only two camps, social progressives and haters, and that a win for one is a loss for the other. There is a third group, one that advances a fair-to-all approach. That is not a zero-sum game. How are you going to change the culture in our communities, administrations, and schools from the current divisive zero-sum game approach to advancing a unified, pluralistic society?
Great, yeah, okay. We'll solve that. I should have this one solved here. Ultimately, I will say, we are looking to get to what I would call a productive discussion. We've had issues come up within our community, and I've watched it, particularly in the digital environment, where each side, so to speak, will go to their corner and collectively, verbally at least, kind of lob, ammunition back and forth, and it's not productive. You're absolutely true. It's not productive. It doesn't necessarily lead towards us developing a deeper understanding of where we all are at as a community and how we want to move forward as a community. I think the idea of us moving forward as a community is really understanding. And so we are, I think there's two camps in terms of this, and it's a frustration or a scenario that I've articulated to the DEI committee. There are times where it feels like this is moving very slow. And there are times where it feels like we need to really think about how taking an entire meeting or really a meeting and a half to look at definitions and have a deep conversation around that really starts to build that bedrock of trust. Ultimately, if you think we want to come together as a community, there needs to be trust. If you or we don't trust each other as a community, if we don't trust individuals who may think or feel differently about an organization or a scenario than we do, getting to the middle is really not much of an option. And so I think what we've tried to do in the committee, at least, is develop some trust about where we're at, the perspectives we bring, be respectful in that conversation, and then start to discuss if we're looking at a shared definition. And we had some kind of interesting debate about the words that we used in there, not because we're excited about the specific words, but we knew what those words implied. And when you step out of that room, and we present those tonight, we need to make sure that those definitions are broad enough, but yet succinct enough to be able to be a spot where we can start to build trust. And I think that's really what it comes to.
Okay, the next question is, how will parents know when controversial issues will be taught?
The idea of controversial topics or controversial issues is something, we do have a board policy around it. That was something we discussed, I think, at our second meeting and was shared about kind of the process. And so we have a board policy around it, and it's specific in terms of how we handle it. I think one of the questions came down to, and maybe a tangent of that question is it a proactive or reactive notification process? And the statement I would use is probably a little bit of both. And I'm thinking of scenarios where we've been proactive in terms of an opt-out, and we've also been in situations where we've shared information, and then it seems like, hey, what's going on? I need more information. I need more feedback in terms of this specific curricular resource. Two things come to mind. One is our teachers are excellent communicators in terms of what is going on in their classroom, newsletters, emails, and different things associated with syllabus if it's at the high school level that you can get and understand what's going on in those classrooms. We had two specific situations that came up where we did proactively notify the members of the community or whoever's in those classes about specific things that we anticipated may be controversial in terms of their approach. But the concept that we will always be in a situation where we're going to be sharing information that in saying we feel this may be a controversial topic is not necessarily what we would anticipate. If it's saying, are we sharing what's going on in the classroom? Absolutely. That is an expectation. I feel like our teachers, for the vast majority, do an excellent job of that. As parents and as community members, it's important that when that information comes out, it may not say controversial topic. It's going to say what's going on. And as a parent, that's an opportunity to have a dialogue either with your child and or the teacher to say, what is this? I need to know more about this. I'd like to know more about this.
The next question is, how does the DEI committee plan to address the myriad of issues before it, such as forums, websites, emails? How does it plan to implement those results in a school setting?
Can you repeat the question?
Sure. It's getting the gist of there's lots of social media and information that we need to communicate. How do we
Yeah, I think, and I touched on it during the presentation. One of the things, I think the committee understands that there is a fair amount of interest in the activities of the committee. And so I think the opportunity to really look at saying, how do we best find a repository for that's very visible from a community perspective, and people can get used to saying, if I want to see what's going on, if I want to see what additional resources are there, that would be the spot. So I think this DEI tab, for lack of a better word, is really what we're thinking about in terms of sharing information. We're not going to typically go on social media as an organization other than to share links and revert back to our organization or our organizational website as it relates specifically to resources. The next kind of iteration of that is to really begin to categorize, and I'll go back to kind of this conversations I had today with staff of what's going on in our classrooms as it relates to these activities. And so the DEI tab may not just be what the committee is doing as it relates to it, but it may be just these are the things that are going on in our organization that tie back to the mission in charge, so we can better articulate and kind of I think about this needs assessment and what we're learning about what's currently going on in our organization as a spot to share information. So it's broader than just the committee when I think of that DEI tab, but it would be the spot to go and get information about what is going on. And we certainly can have links there to look at this, and then if you have questions, let us know, and we'll respond to those.
Thank you. How will SAS teach about transgender issues while ensuring that gender atypical children and those with a weak gender identity are not bullied or falsely led to think that they have to transition to have a good outcome?
I think the issue of the transgender students within our buildings, and or I didn't see the term used, but essentially the idea that a student who's questioning will be influenced by the activities they have or the text that we're reading or something along those lines. We do have if it's someone who is questioning or concerned about their gender identity, that's a conversation that would then go through the adults in the room, so it would be the teacher, the social worker at the building, and a conversation with the parent to better understand that. The idea of influence, I guess I'm not 100% comfortable with saying that the reading of a text is going to influence per se. I think the idea that we want to make sure, and Dr. Lotch talks about this a lot, this idea of windows and mirrors within our curriculum, so that if I'm a student, I can see myself in the text, and I can also see others in the text. I think how that student or that child defines what is a window and what is a mirror is a very different conversation. Again, if a student's articulating that to an adult, then we would have a process associated with that, and it would be unrelated to an instructional strategy, and that becomes more of a one-on-one and or family and school conversation.
In what situations or scenarios is it appropriate to give sexual education to preschoolers? How could this benefit them?
From a standpoint of, we don't have sexual education at the preschool level, at the kindergarten level. Our sex education program begins at the 4th grade level per the Michigan curriculum. I think if I'm reading kind of between the lines, the inference is that maybe the showing of I Am Jazz was sexual education. I think we've, as in vetting that out, that was not and is not sexual education as defined by Michigan compiled law.
Right, and I'll add to that the Sex Education Advisory Board certainly does review curriculum and currently is reviewing curriculum, but that's still focused at the grades 4 through 12 level. So the plans to move the sexual education program into preschool or anything before 4th grade is not being set in front of the Sex Education Advisory Board. Next question. What practices does the district have in place to prevent bias in hiring?
Well, I will tell you the one thing this year, the Harvard bias, they have essentially an assessment to try to understand our own biases. And so individuals who are involved with the hiring process now, particularly in the hiring committees, we are having go through this bias, I don't call it training, because essentially it really is about a self-assessment in terms of their own bias. One of the things, and this was a conversation we had today, when we talk about our hiring practices, one is casting the broadest net possible to make sure people know we are hiring, we do have positions available, and that ultimately we want to be seeking individuals who have diverse perspectives to come and apply for our district, and so that our candidate pool is not one that is refined to, hey, we're going to recruit in Washtenaw County. We went to several college job fairs this year in terms of really trying to not only say we're going to be very open about the interest in hiring staff, and again, that's been a pretty significant shift from 5 years ago when we really felt like we didn't have many openings and we're concerned about that. So now we want to make sure people know we're hiring, consider us, think about us. The next step of that is that if we're say we're going to hire we're going to hire top-notch staff that however you want to define it will be defined as diverse staff. We need to be a welcoming environment. We need to be a welcoming organization, and frankly, the staff that come in, and I will be very honest, we had a staff who of color who we hired a couple years ago, and they need to know that as administrators we're supportive. They are going to be an environment where they might be the only Muslim teacher in their building, and how are we going to support them as an organization? And I think so. It goes beyond the idea like we're just going to go out and say we're going to hire diverse staff. We need to walk the walk, because the last thing we want to do is to hire someone saying we want a diverse staff and then not be supportive of the fact that we want to make sure we understand what that means and how we act as a school district, how we act as a community is one where they can best educate our students. So it's more than just the hiring process. It's, hey, we need to be an organization that walks the walk as it relates to our staff.
The next question is about the book George. The author of George states that his book will not cause people to become transgender. People used to think that secondhand smoke could not cause cancer. What scientific evidence do you have that this book will not affect the self-esteem of atypical children and children with a weak sense of gender? An individual named Carrie posted a YouTube video after she detransitioned, stating that she felt she had to transition because she was gender non-conforming. And why is the discussion of the book George never mentioned in the posted minutes from the DEI meetings?
Two things. One is I don't have any scientific evidence. Just that I don't have a lot of scientific evidence on a variety of other narrative stories that we have, and characters that are exposed to in terms of our students. So the 100% fact, we have zero scientific evidence as it relates specifically to that question. I will say I'm not sure why George. We did talk about George in the context of the thing. And I don't know, Steve, you want to talk?
Yeah, I would say we should post that we had a conversation about that, so we can go back and look at that. And we are doing our best to post the minutes that take place at the DEI meetings. So
yeah, and I'll jump in a little bit more on George, because ultimately I can articulate a little bit more about what that conversation kind of entailed. One, many of the members of the committee read the book, to kind of understand, because one of the issues that comes out a little bit in terms of the themes associated, not really even with just the book George, but other books we have, is it's not really necessarily about the characterization of the characters per se. It becomes an age-appropriate question. And we all define that a little bit differently. So we had, I think, a healthy conversation about that. When we talk about notification process, that was one that was proactively. The parents and families of that in that group class that were notified ahead of time and offered an opportunity to come in and talk with the teacher about that. So there was again a proactive or acknowledgement from the part of the teacher in that case that this was potentially a controversial topic, and wanted to create some dialogue around that well before the intended lesson was to begin. And again, the intended lesson really, as much of this comes down to this idea of being an inclusive and welcoming environment for all students, and exposing individuals within our school district to windows and mirrors in terms of some of the characters they see in the books that we read. And then ultimately, too, the next step is an alternative assignment. And in that case, the teacher provided an alternative assignment. So if a parent and a family said, this book is a theme that, for whatever reason, we just don't want to necessarily read right now, we have another book that is appropriate in that sense. And that is part of the process. We, on virtually any issue, literally on any issue, we will have, and by policy and by practice, provide alternative assignments. And so this idea that we're mandating certain things, I'm not aware of anything we really mandate other than saying if you are seeing a text or something that you don't want to read, we will provide an alternative for that.
How and who decides what is controversial or a controversial topic?
Good question. I mean, that is a tough one in a sense. I think we have a sense around, I'll be very frank about the LGBTQ issues. That certainly, given the conversations that have occurred at our board table, has been one. There, over the years, have been other controversial issues. We have books at the high school level that are read that reference sexual assault. I will tell you, we have families that don't want their child reading about that. And they, that to them is a controversial topic or a controversial issue that they do not want their son or daughter to read in school or be, otherwise have conversation around. So, that's one that, that to me is not controversial. It's a serious issue, but there's one that we kind of implement our controversial issue policy associated with it.
Right, and would allow for any parent who wanted to talk to a teacher about the controversy they see in it to provide them with an alternative activity.
Ultimately, I guess I'll go back to so in the case I'll go back to the example I used with the issue of sexual assault. Ultimately, the parent decides what's controversial. So when in that scenario, the syllabus comes out, there's a book and a text that has a certain type of either depicts a character or has an activity or a scene, so to speak, in the book that they may be uncomfortable with. That parent at that time decides it's uncomfortable. Scott Graydon doesn't decide it's a controversial topic. Dr. Lotch doesn't. The English teacher in that case does not determine that it's a controversial topic. The parent does. And again, it goes back to this idea of communication from a classroom standpoint is we're sharing that information ahead of time. And it's important as parents that we're looking at those, understanding that here's a title of a book we're maybe reading I don't know anything about. Email the teacher, can you give me more information about this book? What has been the context of this book? I think, again, I want to give credit to our teachers. They are thoughtful in terms of the curriculum that they put together and are ready to make modifications if necessary. But again, the parent decides, not me. Yeah, I can answer that question later. I'll be here all night.
So the next question is, do administrators or teachers, especially at the high school level, have unconscious bias or bystander intervention training? If not, is it something the district is considering in order to create an inclusive and equitable environment?
And we touched a little bit on it. The answer is not all. Some do, and it comes through particularly the folks that were involved with the justice group out of the WISD. We've had other staff that we've hired that have had experiences and training in other districts and other communities. We have not done a broad, full-scale every teacher gets X type of training as it relates to that. The one exception, or not even exception, the one kind of note would be what I talked about the first time. Dr. Mark's presentation to the entire staff that started the school year touched on some of those topics, but particularly didn't go in like specifically this idea of interrupting the potentially behavior that's occurring in a classroom as it relates to kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. Understanding how to handle that, we do need more training in that. And I think, again, I'll talk to the staff that we talked to today, wanted more support and to feel like they had more tools in their toolbox as it relates to that.
It's also talked about all the time at the high school level, especially in the English and Social Studies department, about making sure that we are providing balance and an inclusive curriculum. In addition, a number of teachers that have gone through the social justice training are working in the summer to put together professional development for our teaching staff to offer some after-school sessions for those teachers who are wanting to learn more about this, because it is an important topic and we do want to provide more PD around it. The next question is, why not offer an opt-in rather than an opt-out option regarding controversial topics?
Because we don't decide what's controversial. I mean, that's the...
The next one. There are many atypical gender kids who need support being who they are without being socialized into transitioning. How are we boosting and supporting those students? Why is the extreme view being pushed?
I think there's a little bit of a disconnect in terms of some of the public discussion around our texts and the reality in our classrooms. We've talked specifically really about two texts, the I Am Jazz book and the George book specifically. And not that those are the only texts we have in our organization that have characters that are transgender or gender atypical, as that card noted. There are all kinds of other texts that are in the classroom, and so this concept that we're somehow, I think, socializing towards something may not be an accurate reflection of the curriculum as a whole. And so I think there's that. And again, we'll go back, if a student or a child in our district is working through any kind of issue, we would have a process associated with adult support for that.
Okay, the next question is, well, I'll read the comment before the question. Controversial issue requires B, does not tend to indoctrinate or persuade students. George was written by a trans activist. They don't yet have the hang-ups adults do, and if they meet kids like Melissa, maybe they never will. This is an author's quote. So where's the other view then? This was written by an activist.
Yeah, so
other view?
I mean, in terms of I'll go back to the idea of like, that's one text that was written, one that was also then proactively communicated to and an alternative assignment provided if so chooses. There were numerous books read in that class this year that may or may not have been kind of authored by an activist. If we start to kind of indict or discuss the motives of our authors, as I think of some of the stuff we're reading. I mean, Frank, I'm not going to disparage authors as a segment of our human population, but I will tell you, historically, there have been all kinds of motivations behind and behaviors associated with our authors, and we're not in a position of saying we're going to determine the specific intent of an author as it relates to things they do away from the book. We have read the book. We acknowledge that the book has themes that are worthy of conversation and review, and again, we provided that opportunity for our students.
The next question is, I appreciate the district's efforts to provide a more inclusive range of texts. However, I noticed that the district only sends notices home in advance of texts that have trans characters. Since this practice feels like discrimination, are there any plans to stop sending those notices?
I think that I'll go back to kind of what I started before. I think the notification process as being part of the regular communication of the classroom, or again, if it's a group of classrooms, the communication that comes from the teacher is where we want our parents to engage in determining the whether it be the opt-out, I have more questions, I need more information, as opposed to this concept of we're going to be sending notification about specific, if it's related to LGBTQ or transgender, then that we know that just raises to the level. Again, that information shared by the teacher needs to be where we essentially provide that context for that conversation between the parent, the teacher, about what's going on in the classroom. I will say, and Dr. Lash and I have talked about, is making sure that our teachers are aware, like, this is important, that our stuff is up to date, that this information is shared, that it's shared in a timely manner, so there can be time for conversation about a book or a lesson or something that they may not see as controversial, but may be something that parents have some questions about, may have concerns about, and want to have further dialogue. So there's a timeliness thing that we need to just make sure our staff understands.
Why are the responses to the public comment referred to the DEI and policy committees? Why can't we hear these discussions?
I think that's referring to that we said there's some of the comments at public comment, and the board, if you've been to a board meeting, the board does not respond to public comment. But the following meeting, they'll note kind of what we're kind of doing with it. And it's my understanding or my feeling that some of the comments at the public participation thing, a couple were specifically related to whether or not certain materials should go to the sex ed board. And that was addressed by administration through and talked to, I know Dr. Lotch went and talked to the sex ed advisory board about that concept. So that would be, it wasn't necessarily referred to the sex ed board, but it was discussed with the sex ed board. And then, as far as other issues associated with the texts that we're reading, conversations that are having, I'll go back to the idea, like the DEI committee, I'll use George, has conversations around these books to provide feedback to administration, that make recommendations to the board, that act on those recommendations. And so I think if you hear the board say, well, why we're not responding to public comment, that will go to the DEI committee. That goes to the DEI committee. Ultimately, it comes back to the board, as opposed to, and so in some ways, when the board says we're referring that to the DEI committee, they're essentially saying we're going through the chain of command. Just as if a parent calls me and says, I have a concern about my teacher, my first question is, have you talked to the teacher? And I think that's somewhat what that conversation, if you come to the top of the chain and you say what's going on within this activity, we're going to refer it to the chain. We want it to come back through and come back up. So I understand, or the board understands what's going on, but there's a process associated with that. So it's not as though they're not going to respond to it. It's not ready for action yet, I guess is how I would take it. I don't remember any, if someone has a specific thing that was mentioned in public comment that they want to know what's going on with, certainly at the end, come up and ask me.
The next question is, well, I'll read the comment first. I noticed that political affiliation is not included in DEI's definition of protected classes that deserve celebration or protection. Differences amongst political opinions is one of the major causes of bullying in schools today. I would know, I lived through it in school. Does DEI have a plan to amend the definition to involve political affiliation?
Yeah, we had a lot of conversation around this issue. I think the term we use was political perspective as opposed to affiliation, because that has a different connotation and indicates that there's some type of, you may have a perspective that no one else has, and therefore it's your political perspective, but you can't affiliate it with a group or a term or a party. And so we talked about that, and I would say we are open to potentially amending. I am very fearful of what next year, or the fall of September of 2020 looks like leading into an election. And I will tell you, the reason I'm fearful of that is because I know what the fall of 2016 looked like, and even other election cycles. It does articulate some political differences within our community. Frankly, it articulates within our nation and other. But it becomes a problem for students. And so, I'm not yet sure exactly what our best strategy is going to be. And again, I'm thinking ahead to kind of next a year from this fall to think about how do we manage that as a community, how do we manage it as a school district, because there are deep divides as it relates to political perspective and the implications of that. And when someone talks about being bullied for their perspective, I certainly see we've dealt with those situations in the past. What I will say, it may not be right now in our definition, but if there's a situation that occurs in our school district, the administration handles it as though it's in there. So it's not like because it's not in there, we're not gonna deal with it, or that's not worthy of us dealing with it. Bullying is bullying, regardless of whether or not it's considered a term that has ended up in any of our definitions.
I understand racial education, but why the sexual/gender dysphoria? This should be an optional sex education class, not to be included in any other social class or unrelated curriculum.
Yeah, it's, I think when you talk about the education, right, we have transgender students in each of our buildings. Those students have faced higher levels of bullying than other student, kind of social identities. And so the idea that we're not going to say that we're not singling out groups and talking about their need for protection that doesn't reflect the reality of what goes on in our buildings, and that doesn't reflect, frankly, our society. And so that is why, if you say, we articulate protected classes, we are articulating our own set of protected classes that we want to say as a community, we're going to make sure we have an explicit understanding of what students face in our buildings.
When and how will future DEI committees be determined?
Good question. I think the idea of a sustaining committee, and I don't want to. We've talked to this group about saying, this isn't the Supreme Court. You don't serve for life per se, but ultimately really thinking about and really changing the makeup. We purposely didn't put a lot of staff on. We have one staff member. We purposely chose not to have student representation in this first kind of iteration as we move towards the end of this calendar year, because we wanted to be able to get some of the work done. We anticipated that there would be some, kind of controversy and/or discussion. We didn't necessarily want students to be involved in. We know we need student voice, and we have opportunities to go and pull that student voice in and help inform our work. But I think the idea of a sustained effort in this area is what we're looking at. And again, I'll go back to this idea of a wellness committee that has a diverse background in terms of staff representation, student representation, community representation, a representative from the board and administration, to really say, how do we look at this and evaluate this on an ongoing basis? How do we vet certain resources? How do we vet certain trainings that we may want to have our staff review? I think those are the things. How do we react to state policy, laws that change as an organization? Those are opportunities for us to really have those conversations over time.
Okay, the next two-part question. Regarding I Am Jazz and George, where do these types of books fall under Michigan education curriculum? That's the first part.
The books specifically aren't, the Michigan education, the MDE has standards that are instructed to be taught at various levels. They don't necessarily say how you go about getting to those standards.
Right. And I would say that we teach a variety of different, expose students to a variety of different trades books and stories. So it doesn't say you have to teach a book like I Am Jazz or George, but it doesn't say that about any of the trade books that students are reading in the reading and writing workshop, for example. The next question is, why is mindfulness, which falls under yoga and meditation, introduced in classrooms without prior communication for parents? Where does it fall under Michigan curriculum?
Yeah, Michigan curriculum, again, doesn't speak specifically to mindfulness. I would say that's an example of something that I would want our teachers to be communicating about upfront and proactively, and saying, these are the things we're doing, these are the activities. We've talked a lot about, I think, specific books, but it's certainly from a standpoint of, if we're going to do some mindfulness activities, here are some of the activities that are coming up in the next month. As a parent or family member, you can determine whether or not you want to ask more questions about what does this specifically look like, what are they going to be asked to do. The idea of reflective practice is something we do focus on. We are concerned about the social emotional health of all of our students, and so we've looked to try to determine what are some strategies to help our students reflect on their own understanding of their learning, their own understanding of their social and emotional health. And I will tell you, we've had success at the high school level in particular. We have a mindfulness course. Now, it's a little bit different in that context because you are signing up for the course. It's not embedded in another course. You're choosing that as an option. So it's a little bit different, but the numbers of students choosing that have been very high.
When can we expect the district to start making concrete changes within the schools to make them safer, more welcoming, and more inclusive of all students?
Well, I guess the question would be concrete. I mean, when you talk about specific training, specific opportunities to work with staff, to specific opportunities to share resources about what we're doing and what we value, I think I consider those to be concrete examples of what we're doing as an organization to make sure that our buildings are safe for all students.
What can the DEI committee, I think, do to ensure adequate representation of LGBTQ and books, materials, education in the Saline Area Schools curriculum in K-12?
You know, I'll go back to the DEI committee. It does not approve curriculum, and so the job of our teachers are to help work through Dr. Lotch's department to develop our curricular resources, develop our curriculum, hit Michigan standards, and so the ideas would be to work with our, if the committee has books and texts that we want to talk about, to get feedback on, certainly, but that would come from our faculty that would be presenting those. And I will say, and Steve, I don't know if you want to touch on, you mentioned a little bit, our English department would be an example in a way.
Right, in our English department, so a conversation the English department at the high school is having is, are certain books that we are presenting from largely a white author's viewpoint completely appropriate? And so they are having discussion about that. Are there other texts that could be more inclusive, still teach the same message, and be able to accomplish the same standards that they are working towards?
Yeah. The Foundation for Saline Area Schools recently had a grant to provide dollars to help purchase books for our libraries that are media centers that are inclusive in nature. In terms of, so that again, another kind of concrete example of us making sure that we have texts available for our students. Those are largely choice. The student would have to choose those, but again, they're available.
Next question is, if I Am Jazz is not a sex education material resource, what do you consider is sex ed?
It's very prescriptive in terms of the standards in the Michigan curriculum that we have, and I other than singing just around the corner, I'm not in a position where I'm gonna get into very specifics, but it is available and it's on our website in terms of the specific content associated with sex ed.
Right, it's not part of the program of study, and we've had conversations with Michigan Department of Education, local health officials, and even discussed it with our legal team to determine, is that something that should go through the Sex Education Advisory Board, and each time we've heard that it does not.
I will say, I think one of the things, so the concept of gender identity is not sexuality. And I think that's really at the bedrock of some of the conversation around gender identity as sexuality. So, I don't know if that helps anyone. And there may be some disagreement on that, but that is what, when we've talked to MDE, when we've talked to the MASB and their team, and we've talked to our attorneys and saying, if you were to look at this, how are you doing? That's what it all comes back to.
Very disappointed with sexualizing agenda and trans agenda. I understand racial issues, but not sexual. Who approved this committee and the process?
The board approved the committee. The committee itself was, after the application was done, Dr. Lash and I were the ones who selected the committee and put the committee together, and that approved. So any disappointment should really start with me, and then Steve gets a little.
Research shows that representation in media is critical to helping youth feel comfortable and confident in their identities. What is the district doing to increase diversity of characters and situations in our media and curriculum?
Well, I touched on it a little bit. We are thoughtfully trying to think about the text that we have available for our students. And again, and Steve, I don't know if you want to touch on the windows and mirrors concept, because that really is kind of from a theme standpoint or from a strategy standpoint, that is what we want from a resources for our students.
Right, I can do that. So the conversation we've had multiple times within our social justice cohort is that it is very important for students to be able to see themselves in the curriculum. That's the mirrors part, and windows, so we can have empathy for all different groups of people, and thus we want to make sure that we provide some opportunities for our students to do that. The next question, the DEI does not directly make decisions on accepting or rejecting books. What is the DEI's stance or comment on the I Am Jazz reading? And what influence did the DEI committee have on the decision?
Well, it It didn't. I mean, so the I Am Jazz was presented to us as a district and to me personally through the WISD and the Washtenaw County Health Department in the November-December window. We read it in December. This committee was discussed at the January 8th meeting, essentially a month later, and it took about a month to get the committee off the ground. So they did not have a role at all in that. In fact, that was essentially almost 2 months past.
This is more or less a follow-up question to that one from a different person. Is this supposed to be a representative committee, and how can I find out who is most similar to my views?
I think you mentioned it's representative of the applicant pool. We had approximately 80 applicants, and we went through. And if you did fill out the application, there was a variety of questions associated with that, and we did try to select members that had views that were very diverse in terms of their responses. And so not only in terms of they're diverse relative to other members of the committee, but certainly we looked at, and we did try to kind of characterize to a degree. We did try to think about, okay, how do we go about putting this together? We were grateful that we had a large number of participants, but we knew we needed to keep the group small enough to be able to be effective in terms of conducting meetings, making progress, getting feedback, and moving forward. And it's been, as I talked about, this kind of move fast, move slow. It's been a challenge because these are heavy topics, these are deep topics, and so certainly the size is there. As far as individual perspectives, I think we looked at people who had maybe not only positions on certain things, and they articulated that those in the comments in terms of the answers to the questions. So we knew we had people who had different positions on issues. What we did look for as well is a disposition to talk about those issues. What we were additionally wanting is that we can have different views, and I will tell you over the several meetings we have, I don't want to say opposing views, but certainly diverse opinions about this work and our thoughts around that. But the disposition of the membership needed to be one that allowed for conversation to occur, to develop processes around consensus so that we can get shared feedback back up through administration to the board. And so as far as who best aligns with that, obviously I can't answer that.
We seem to be pushing the agenda on LGBTQ and not the conservative view of parents and students. Do you plan to have as part of the curriculum a conservative book and expect kids to read and discuss such books?
I hazard to kind of use the conservative, liberal, progressive, non-progressive. I don't know how you characterize in that regard, but there is, I think, because of the public conversation around specifically the two books that I've mentioned, I Am Jazz and George, there is a disproportionate amount of thought that this is the conversation going on. If you walk to any of our buildings on a daily basis, these are not texts that are being widely discussed. When we talk about the George book, that was a book that was read within one sixth grade team. And so this concept like this is being, kind of this pushing of the agenda. I would tell you, we have a variety of texts that are read that come from what may be considered conservative perspectives in terms of in class. We don't have community forums that we talk about them, but they occur to a much greater extent than the two books we're talking about tonight.
Was anyone other than Mr. Graydon involved in bringing Amy Tesselin, a social justice champion, and I think it should say to the committee? If so, who? If not, why not?
So Amy Tesselin is someone we've talked about and are looking to have help facilitate the conversation around developing consensus. She's a member of our community, happens to be Canadian, which I find interesting in terms of being a part of our community, but ultimately really applied for the committee and wanted to be a part of it. There are other people who came from Pleasant Ridge, actually, who were supportive of. I had a conversation with Kevin Musson about Amy and got some feedback that was positive. And again, we're looking for facilitation. If the concern is influence, I would say, the influence in terms of the committee, again, that focus should come at myself and Mr. Lodge, Dr. Lodge.
How does transgender and alternative lifestyle education contribute to the technological and scientific progress of our society?
Repeat the question.
How does transgender and alternative lifestyle education contribute to the technological and scientific progress I can read, there's more here. As you used to be a leader in the world in science and technology teaching, I perceived a correlation between the school's deviation of focus from math, science, and reading to social studies, alternative lifestyles, transgenderism, and the decline of the U.S. educational system in the world.
Okay. I'll first start by saying I reject the term alternative lifestyle, just to start with, in terms of where that goes. But, certainly the idea of lifestyle, and I will tell you I also then categorically reject the idea that we're not focused on technology and certainly the appreciation of science. We have never, as a school district, offered more opportunity as relates to STEM fields and to STEM education than we do today. Dr. Lotch and I were involved with implementation of Project Lead the Way several years ago, which is a nationally based, science, technology, and engineering curriculum. We've spent, countless hours, times, energy, resources in much, again, really dwarfing the amount of time we spend as it relates to lifestyle conversations.
And if I could add, we just have now moved to having Innovation Lab as one of the specials at the elementary school. And I know that not everybody was supportive of that we are moving away from elementary Spanish, but that intention was to make sure that we had great focus on innovation along with engineering concepts and such. The next question is a follow-up to adding political perspective to DEI protected classes. Why do we need to list any, question mark? Wasn't it always best to someone feeling, wasn't it always subject to somebody being left out? Why not just prohibit bullying?
Yeah, that's the conversation we've had, and to the extent that this idea of bullying is not tolerated, therefore why do we need to essentially define in some ways other versions of protected classes? I will say one, U.S. law has protected classes, and so to not indicate one, there are certainly in cases as it relates to government, we have to list the constitutionally protected classes by definition in our policy. And so I will say our definition of diversity goes beyond those specifically, kind of constitutionally protected classes as it relates to identities or descriptors. That's based on what we've had we've seen and experienced in our buildings. And so I would say that our list there is responsive to what we see in our community, which is what we would want to be in terms of thinking about our community. I think the protected class list that we see at the U.S. Supreme Court level is kind of the baseline, not necessarily the only end-all, be-all. And I think we're open to the idea of political perspective. We talked about a few other terms, trying to think about how we go about doing that. There is this concept of if you start to talk a lot about differences, then it somehow diminishes the collective similarities. And it's an interesting concept and an important conversation to have. But in a community like ours, particularly when I think about some of the racial makeup of our community, if we don't talk about our differences, there are individuals in our community, and with the term we kind of have called out, there's marginalized, who then are not represented. All doesn't really mean all. All may mean all to me because of my identity, but it doesn't mean all to everyone in our buildings. And so it's again, I think it's a worthy conversation, and one when you start to think if we're only talking about our differences, we're not discussing our similarities. The conversation about differences should lead us back to our similarities, and I think that's why the committee exists. That's why we are working towards improving.
This is referring to Board Policy 2241. Is the administrative guideline for dealing with controversial issue different than controversial policy? Is it posted anywhere for parents or staff?
No, at this point, we have transitioned to Neola. Our policy is the only document that, or only words, policy is the only portion of it. We do not have an administrative guideline yet adopted for the controversial issues.
Was George approved by the board after going through DEI?
No, in such a way, there was we had a conversation around issue, but it was not approved, nor before or after it was discussed at the DEI committee. I think what the DEI committee was a part of was really defining this concept of what is controversial, what's a controversial topic, and how does that play itself out? What is the communication strategy associated with sharing the information with parents? And then ultimately, what is the board and district policy as it relates to alternative assignments? And so not only controversial topics was discussed, there's another section of our policy, or another policy that talks about parental rights and the right to review materials for their child, as well as then ask for alternative assignments. And so I think that was the discussion that I think was shared with the board, that we have board policy that articulates how we would handle something like the Book George, and that's what we did.
If, as you stated tonight, parents, not the schools, determine what is a controversial issue, then will SAS allow parents to make that call, be transparent, and notify us beforehand, and not make us search through all the classroom materials?
I'll go back to, I don't, if the parent is the holder of what is controversial, it's not possible for us as a district to inform in that regard. Because if you as a parent feel that To Kill a Mockingbird is controversial, we're not sending information out about that book to everyone saying, hey, it's going to be on the syllabus. And again, there is a level of engagement on the part of the parents. And the inference there is that some of the district wants to hide or not talk about some of these things. I think, to be honest, it's not reasonable for us to be able to think about what may be perceived as controversial. And I think we have an active and engaged parent base in our community. It's one of the things that makes our community as strong and vibrant as it is. It's important that we continue to be engaged. And it's important that Dr. Lodge and I talk to our staff about making sure that information shared is up to date, is timely, is open, and they're prepared to have alternative materials and alternative lessons ready to go. I think that's an important component of our readiness factor. I think that's how we address the controversial topic issue, is to be prepared to handle it, as opposed to saying we're going to try to articulate what may or may not be controversial to everyone in our community.
How often are trans issues discussed in classrooms, grades K through 5?
I don't know. To be fair, how often? I will say seldom, and probably very seldom would be a more accurate statement as it relates to that. We've had situations. I will say we've had situations where we've had a transgender student in the classroom, and there have been a fair amount of conversation in that classroom because of that situation, that scenario. And so, we've talked about books being read, or everything. I'm familiar with elementary classrooms where we've had multiple books read to that classroom, conversation, parent meetings to talk about the makeup of that class, share the situation as it relates to a student. Parents, in that case, the parents of the student in the classroom were able to share openly and directly with that family about that issue. So if you want to say that in that classroom, they talked about it a lot, because they were working through a scenario as it related to that student in that elementary classroom. But the concept that these are just topics, it's, again, I'll go back to this, the conversation at the adult level is disproportionate to the conversation at the teacher and student level, particularly around the K-5 buildings.
Does Saline schools have any time left to teach English, math, science, or history?
I'll go back to the conversation is disproportionate. Now, if we want to make a collective community agreement that we will only talk about English, science, technology, and math at our board meetings, I'm down with making an agreement as a community and say, if you want to hear more about what we're doing in our classrooms, then we're more than willing to have those conversations. I think, June 11th, we're talking about our innovation lab and talking about those. We're excited about that transition to that and what that can mean for our students in terms of engaged learning and opportunities. I'd love to talk about the compass more at board meetings, and really next year when we get back to reviewing our strategic framework and talking about that. And I will tell you the number one issue with senior schools right now is our financial security and our financial stability. And so, we can't get to those conversations, it feels like sometimes, because of where we're at. We want a DEI committee that's thoughtful and respectful, and we're willing to share the information. But if the perception is, in our buildings, this is the only conversation going on, we risk ourselves as an organization. And so I think it's important that the community understands that the threats to our community are not related to DEI issues. the threats to our community are largely financial, and our ability to, if you want to talk about the academic core content areas, our ability to provide the resources in those areas is critical.
And I will add to that we try to celebrate and promote all the great academic things that are going on in the district. Every Monday when we post news and notes, we showcase all these student celebrations and all the great things they are doing related around the core academic content. And we are hoping that parents are able to see that that is taking place all the time. The next question. What happens when transgender and gays invade my religion? And how are you going to respond when I feel that my privacy is invaded? For example, I may be using the restroom and the opposite sex walks in.
Yeah, from a standpoint, it's essentially kind of what I would call the bathroom scenario. We have a variety of opportunities for access to, boys' restrooms, girls' restrooms, and gender-neutral restrooms. And so, from the standpoint of where our students or staff want to use the restroom, that's not an issue for us, and we'll continue to work to make sure everyone has a variety of formats to use the restroom. If someone is, and I equate that almost more to if someone has a perspective and they're sharing that and they're being taunted, there's this criticisms of them that are not based on an idea but are based on a person, we take those seriously regardless of the context. And so the idea that somehow if you exhibit one social identity, you have carte blanche, and if you exhibit another, you're somehow not protected is not a factual statement.
The next question is very similar. It asks about the restroom, but it also asks about sharing a locker room.
Yeah, we've developed at our high school, we have kind of, again, I'll call them gender neutral spaces. And ultimately, I will say, the people who are impacted by that, the individuals that are impacted by that, are largely, our transgender students choose the gender neutral one. The what I would call the biological sex identifying boys and girls continue to use the locker rooms. And so the individuals typically I would call displaced are in reality on a daily basis the transgender students. But we have accommodated that in that context.
What kind of financial investment is SAS planning on putting towards diversity training?
It certainly depends. To be fair, we paid J. Marks to come. Both administratively and for the group. The culturally responsive instruction, we haven't vetted out what that would cost in terms of if we were to implement that district-wide. It probably wouldn't be inexpensive, but I will tell you, I'll go back to this concept of that instructional strategies that I've read about as it relates to that are best practice in terms of instructional strategies. I think about the inclusivity training that we've done around students with special needs, and our investments there have paid dividends for our general education population over time. And so this idea like we're gonna invest in cultural responsive because we're concerned about DEI, everyone benefits from that. And so again, we're gonna spend money on teacher and staff training regardless, and we may choose to do that based on our professional judgment and feedback from the board.
And to add on to that, I mentioned this earlier, but we are working with a group of teachers that have been through social justice training, have great experience with helping to implement greater diversity in the curriculum. We'll be working with them this summer to make sure that we have some professional development offerings for our staff for next year. Next question is, what is the current ratio of males to females on the DEI committee? Were members selected with a desire to have a balanced ratio?
I don't know off the top of my head. I'm not going to hazard to go down the ratio. Essentially, you're starting to talk about observable diversity in a way, and that's a whole another kind of issue in terms of where we go. I will say it was representative. The group is representative of proportionally of the applicant pool. In terms of perspective, it's somewhat balanced. We had a lot more females than males apply. We have more females than males on the committee. But
the next question is related to IMJazz. Going back to IMJazz and the time from that the parents were notified of the book to have it be part of teaching, when was the book chosen to be read, or I think it says read, to the kids? and why the parents were not notified at the beginning of the school year instead of the week of?
Yeah, it was notified, I think I would say probably the second Friday in November would have been when there was a meeting at the WISD with all the county superintendents where the video, essentially it wasn't really a reading, technically it was a video of the reading, and the reading was made up of individuals from throughout Washtenaw County. That video was made, had already been made at that time, and the discussion that districts would be showing that video in an upcoming time was, so I would say 14th, I think we showed it around the 7th or so. There was the Thanksgiving break in between there. So that's the timeline. So it would not be fair to say that we, at the start of the school year, that video was on the docket to be played on that Friday.
How will the district change public comment at the Board of Education meetings?
The conversation that you've seen, there's a statement that was said that students will be kind of given deference by the board president, and we're changed. The form has changed so that there's a box for students to check if they're a student, and again, they'll be given deference to come forward first in that regard. Other than that, right now there have been no other fundamental changes to public policy or public comment. There's conversation around it, and again, the board would be the ones who would handle that.
Does the district believe that the minimum standard for respecting all students and parents' beliefs is to be transparent and notify parents prior to teaching or introducing any transgender or sexual topics?
Two things. One is the idea of introducing a transgender topic, and the idea of introducing a text that has a character who happens to be transgender are two different concepts in my books. And I think what I'm hearing is that if there's a book that has a character who is transgender or is depicted as being transgender, that parents are notified. Right now, that would be, if there's a text that's being read in a class, parents would be informed. And I think so you think about informed and notified may have a different connotation in terms of how that plays out, but the informed component would be part of the teacher's normal communication as it relates to the what's going on in the classroom. It is kind of, I think fair to say that when I say the district, it's the idea that the central office will be making notifications associated with text that, for example, I use George as an example. We didn't communicate at the district level about that text. That was done at the classroom level. And again, it was done proactively and ahead of time as it relates to kind of the context of the conversation tonight, but it wasn't the district. So the parents were informed of it. But I think the concept of a notification almost implies, at least as I think about that, applies something at the district level that I would, that the central office, the superintendent, notifying, kind of thing. I think informed would be the term I would use, and certainly it begins at the teacher level.
We're 5 minutes before 8, and according to Laura and Carol have done a nice job of sorting questions. We've gotten to every question except for 4, which are deemed to be repeats, but we'll read them anyway because we still have 5 minutes. Could it be considered a form of discrimination to single out books like George and others that have LGBTQ characters as potential controversial issues that require parent notification?
I think you could make that argument in terms of saying, there's, if the board were to have a policy that said if there's a character in a book that exhibits A, B, and C traits, this triggers some type of a district notification, that would be a separate treatment than we would for normal, the remainder of our curriculum. And so, again, that's not something that is being considered. Again, we're going to this idea of teachers being the individuals who would inform the class and the parents about what's going on in those classrooms.
The next question, a new question, is SAS going to implement a new sex education curriculum? And if so, when and what is it? I can take that one. Teresa Stager, who's here tonight, she helps advise the Sex Education Advisory Board, and they are looking at updated curriculum, but it is not already at a spot where they're saying, okay, this is what we're going to be implementing. They are looking at and determining if is appropriate. And that would be grades 4 through 12. I think the other thing that people were wondering about is that going to start in kindergarten? That's being looked at 4 through 12 grade level. Okay, we've got new questions. Okay, new questions. Can we as parents expect to know at the beginning of the school year the controversial issues that are going to be provided during the school year and expect the school to stick to the curriculum template?
I think that the framework of our curriculum, is determined prior to the start of the year. I think some of the things we talk about, there's curriculum and then there's the resources associated with that. That is where it does become an issue in terms of saying what specific texts are going to be read at specific times. And I'll use the workshop model at the elementary level. There's a great deal of student choice associated with what they want to read. Students can bring books in that they may want to read, and our concern from a literacy standpoint is that they're reading books at their level and or slightly above, and there's some strategy associated with trying to make sure that our students are gaining literacy skills as it relates to the text reading. So the idea that we have a whole set of books, and again, I'm really kind of talking at this K-5 level, that are being read as a classroom really is not how that system and process works anymore. There's a great deal of student choice. If you've been into any of those classrooms now, there's kind of this disconnect between, everything's digital, we're on screens all day. We have more books in this district than ever before. And they're in the classroom, and they're available for our students to look. There's a great deal, if you're on our email list, constant sharing of text in terms of. So to say that we're going to say what books they're going to read, my child in one class may read a certain book. Your child in the same class would read a different book. And so, again, it's about the teacher understanding, what type of information can be shared from a collective standpoint, so that you as parents, can really review that and understand that.
Right, and Scott's touching on K through 8 with that workshop approach. At the high school level, when it comes to English classes, there are some required readings that your teachers can certainly share ahead of time that you can go through and determine if you feel like there are any controversial issues inside of any of those books, and then the teachers will provide an alternate assignment, alternate reading, if you feel that that's the case. It's just that at the workshop model, there are so many different possibilities that students can choose. It would be virtually impossible to provide any sort of list at that level. Let's do one more question, and we're at 8 o'clock. How long is the DEI term for the committee?
I've asked that we've asked the committee to really commit to the end of this calendar year. So really commit through December to be a part of it, and then we'll have to determine one. They all just love coming and doing what they're doing. I really appreciate that, but. The idea would be then that we would have some type of, anyway you call it a reconstitution, but some type of a sustainable model, and we would look to say, is that the appropriate time for us to do, have increase the number of staff members that are involved? Because again, I think, this really is a first iteration, and there's a broader approach over time when I think about sustainability and understanding of what we're trying to do as an organization as relates to resources. And I think, if you look through the presentation, you'll see that strategy. As terms of what's next. So as Steve and I have noted, I'm thankful for you taking the time to come, provide us with questions, getting feedback, understanding what we're really trying to do in terms of the actions of the committee. We'll be here. Feel free to come up and have conversation. Send us emails there, and thank you.